I'm now going to continue my video series on 1950s music with an instrumental piece of music. Now you have to keep in mind, back at that time, movie theaters were a major deal. As a matter of fact, in the 1940s, people used to travel to the movie theater to view World War II movie footage. That's right. They would hear about the war on the radio, but in order to actually see video footage of what was going on over there, they actually had to travel to the movie theater because a lot of them didn't have television sets, and even if they did, most of the time that kind of stuff wouldn't show on the TV. But there you go. Now, sometimes before a theater, a movie theater, would show a feature presentation, like a great big movie, what they would do is they would show a cartoon short and maybe some sort of little documentary or something like that. They would show a cartoon short, then they would show something else, and then they would show a feature flick. Okay? So going to the movies at that time was more like a major family affair than it was, like the teenagers just go to the theater type thing. Now, of course, all that changed between 1950 and 1959, but back at that time, that was the way it was. Okay? Now, that brings us to a feature movie, a feature motion picture, known as The Third Man. Okay? Now, this particular movie was a very popular movie back in 1950. It really was. As a matter of fact, the first hyperlink down below will tell you more about the movie The Third Man, and maybe you'll get a chance to watch it and you'll see just how good it actually was. Okay. Now, keep in mind that back then, people didn't have VCRs. And if you were really lucky, maybe after the motion picture actually left the movie theater, they might broadcast it on television. That's if you were lucky. But here's the catch on something like that. That's, first of all, if you had a television, and more importantly, if your television station was nice enough to actually broadcast it. Yeah, that's if you were lucky. If you weren't so lucky, that didn't happen. And you have to keep in mind that the orientation of movie reel footage was a lot different than what you saw on the TV. The TV screen and the movie screen were very, very different. And even if you did see the motion picture on your television screen, a lot of what you would actually see would be cut out, because it would have to be formatted to actually fit on your screen. We run into those kind of problems even today. Of course, nowadays we have widescreen televisions, but back then they just didn't. So you have to keep that in mind. So, if you weren't lucky enough to actually see the movie on your television set, which most of the time you weren't, then you were forced to actually go to the movie theater to watch the major motion picture. Now, here's the problem. What if you didn't have enough money to actually go to that movie theater to watch that particular film? And a lot of poor kids simply didn't. And they got made fun of a lot for that. Well, there was one remedy for that. Sometimes you couldn't actually afford to go to the movie theater, but they would often make a soundtrack of the music that actually played in that movie. So, if you couldn't afford to actually see the movie itself, perhaps you could actually buy the soundtrack and listen to it. And just imagine what the movie was like. Because a lot of times when they had movies like that, you could get the book. Okay, they would make a paperback book version of the movie, and you could read that, play the soundtrack, and you could fake being at the theater. You say, look, I read the book, I've listened to the soundtrack, I got a pretty good idea what the film looks like. So, technically, in your own way, you actually saw the movie. And you could actually sit there and read the paperback novel or the hardback edition. Maybe you were able to afford a hardback edition, who knows. And you could sit there and read that while you're listening to the music. And then you could just picture in your head what all this looked like. And maybe one day, because remember in those days, when they had a major motion picture they played in the theater for a few weeks, they would take it out of that theater and then say maybe about 9 or 10 months later they'd put it back in and play it for a few more weeks. It's not like today when a movie is pulled out of the theater, they slap it on a DVD and you get to slap it in your hands. They didn't do that back then. They would periodically rerun these movies. That's how they made business. Okay? So, if you were one of the poor kids, and even though you were not able to actually go to the theater and watch the movie itself, perhaps you could go to the library. Because libraries were big back then. They're not like today. Today, libraries are a joke. But back then, they were a big deal because you just didn't have the television and the internet and the VCR and the DVD player and the whole night. All that wasn't there yet. So libraries were a pretty big deal. Maybe you could check out the book. Say, maybe somebody actually wrote out a text edition of The Third Man. I'm pretty sure they did. I don't know whether they did or not, but I'm pretty sure they did. But let's say they did. They wrote out a text edition of The Third Man. You could go to the library, you could check it out, you could read the book, and you're sitting there and you're listening to the soundtrack that you just bought from the record store. Because record stores were big back then. So you go to the store, you buy the record, you're listening to it as you're reading the book, and you could pretty much imagine what the movie would have sounded like. And then you just relate the two, and you could fake going to the movies. You really could. And that's one reason why this particular instrumental became very popular. It sounded good. And if you had the soundtrack, you were halfway there. Now, another reason why this particular soundtrack became immensely popular was that back then, stores did have personal announcement systems. They're not nearly as sophisticated as what they are today. They sounded pretty bad back then. I do remember back in the 70s when I used to go down a place called Landmark Mall. Of course, Landmark Mall doesn't exist anymore, but I used to go down this place called Landmark Mall, and they used to have these little speakers, and the speakers, they didn't do those instrumentals any justice. They really didn't. But the reason these department stores and these grocery stores would actually play these instrumentals on their PA system, which that's what a personal announcement system is, the reason they did that was to, hang on just a second, I got my notes over here. They would lighten the mood of the customers that would come through the door. Okay? Because sometimes these customers had had a bad day. They had just gotten off of work. Maybe they had been dealing with the kids all day, especially the women. Okay, you're talking about women back in the 1950s. They had kids and they had to deal with the kids all day, and they were very stressed out. And this instrumental music was playing in the hopes that it would relax the mood of the customers. And if your customer was more relaxed, they'd be more likely to buy things. See what I mean? And so that's why they did it. So between the department stores, the grocery stores, and just kids that really couldn't afford to go to the theater, so they bought the soundtrack and they either checked out the book or they bought a copy of the book and they read it. That's how that particular instrumental became very popular. Now keep in mind, there weren't that many record labels back at that time. So music companies could be a lot more choosy about what they actually published. Remember, petroleum prices were pretty low back at that time, but you still had to invest a lot of money to press all those records, because records were made out of petroleum at that time. Okay? Not like our digital era today. I'm talking about back then. You had your petroleum products, bam, bam, record, 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 okay? And so, if you're going to press a lot of records, you're going to make a lot of sales, you're going to have to make sure that that music was good and that people would like it. And so these very few record companies, there was about 19 of them at the time, and only like maybe 5 or 6 that were really major ones. If you were really lucky, they liked your music and they pressed it on a record and they sold it in the record stores. If you weren't, you may never get your music heard. That was the way it was back then. So, the instrumental from The Third Man was a very fortunate piece of music. The movie was really popular. They played the soundtrack in all the stores, grocery stores, department stores. Kids went to the record store. They had heard about The Third Man. Maybe they didn't actually go to see the movie. Some of them actually did go see the movie, and they just liked the music so much that they actually bought the soundtrack to go along with it. Maybe their families took them to see The Third Man, and because they liked the movie, they wanted the soundtrack, and that's what they got. Keep in mind that movies back then only ran for a certain period of time. After that, if you wanted to see it, you were just out of luck. Well, whether you saw the movie or you didn't, you could own the soundtrack forever. And they played those soundtracks until they were completely worn out. So you see, there was two specific, distinct ways that this particular soundtrack became popular. Now you say, I want to hear this actual soundtrack. I want to hear this instrumental. Well, you're in luck because they actually have it on YouTube, and I'm going to place a hyperlink down below. It's the second one, and you can actually hear this for yourself. And maybe you can relate to it. Maybe you have actually seen the movie The Third Man. If you haven't, maybe you can find a copy someplace. Maybe you can tell Netflix, hey, I want to see the movie The Third Man. Maybe if you're really lucky, maybe you can find it on YouTube. Who knows? Anyway, that's my next lesson in 1950s music. Now keep in mind that instrumentals in the 1970s were just as popular as they were back in the 1950s, but you had to have the right instrumental. Not all instrumentals were popular, but some of them were. And I know because I used to hear instrumentals by Chuck Mangiolis and Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Band and Love Unlimited Orchestra. So I know how popular an instrumental can actually get. See what I mean? But that's a discussion for the 1970s. In the 1950s, that particular instrumental was very, very popular. That was the two ways that it became popular. And there you go. Actually, some people were rather lucky because sometimes that would actually hit the radio stations too. So maybe you heard it off the radio. Couldn't record it with a Tinker's Ump, but you could actually hear it off the radio. So either the kids would actually buy the soundtrack of the movie, or they would hear it on the department or grocery store speakers, or if they were really lucky, they might actually hear it on the radio. Either way, that's how it became popular. Anyway, let me know what you think about The Third Man. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video, so I want you to stay tuned.